It's just like the first thing you eat in the morning. Some people start their day with a glass of water, right? The first thing that you put in your body, first thing that you pick up, whether it's your phone or whether it's your meditation mat, is significant. It will set expectations for the day. We would have you rehearse before the morning. What are you going to do? Because you're more likely to do it if you rehearse it beforehand.
Hey everyone, what is the most effective way to lose weight long term? Let me tell you, it's not a specific diet, detox, or exercise plan. It's all about mindset. According to Joanna Grover, visualization is the missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to successful weight loss. So why aren't more people talking about it? Jo is a cognitive behavioral therapist and an expert in functional imagery training, or the science of visualizing about your future to stay motivated and change your behavior. In this episode, Jo gives us a crash course on how to practice functional imagery training in your day-to-day, whether you want to overcome cravings, reach a healthy weight, or even reduce anxiety. It is a fascinating topic. I think you'll enjoy it. Jo, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, Jason.
It's great to have you. I think your book is fascinating. And the work you do is really innovative. And let's start there. Talk about your background and the why behind your work and this great new book.
Much like you, part of my health journey was avoiding taking pain pills, wanting an alternative, because I had fallen from a horse. I was an equestrian in the hunter jumpers, and I had had a bad fall. And it really, when you're in pain, when you're suffering, really have to dig deep. And there are sort of easy to go to things that one can use, but I was interested really in the mind. My background is as a cognitive behavioral therapist. And anyway, that journey to understanding how my mind played a significant role in my body's healing was part of what led me to become the first in the US to study functional imagery training, which is, I'm sure, what we're going to get to.
So walk us, like, what type of pain were you in?
So I had fractured my left arm. So the humerus came off the bone and it shattered. So I required two surgeries, and there were two plates and many more screws than I want to remember. And I was on a scale of 1 to 10, I was 10. Because with a shoulder injury, I'm an athlete, so I've had my knees done, I've broken a wrist, snowboarding, but a shoulder, like, you have to sleep upright, and anytime you can't roll over. It's like it's the nighttime pain that's worse than the daytime.
I've dislocated my shoulder, which was a world of pain, not like your pain, but I remember sleeping like I was in a coffin for a while. That was the only way I could sleep. Most people would go to, okay, surgery, pain medication. Talk a little bit more about why you went to the mind and your background.
Well, I have a member of my family who had become addicted to pain pills, so I saw where that led. Part of our work is like put yourself in the future. And I was putting myself, this is before I studied it, so I didn't have the terminology for it. We call it mental contrasting. But at the time, I was just putting myself in the future naturally, and I didn't want that kind of future where I was addicted to something. So it was actually one night when, I had like a dark night of the soul. I was mad at everybody. I was mad at my surgeon, thought he had done a bad job. I went online and I researched him, trying to find like maybe somebody else was in this kind of pain. But instead, what I found was he had won Humanitarian of the Year award for his work putting soldiers back together from Afghanistan. And in his acceptance speech, which I watched online in the middle of the night in my pain, he talked about his first soldier that was medevaced to Germany, where the hospital was that he was training the doctors. And it was a triple amputee. And I listened to his words and I just thought, I am so lucky. Gratitude is one of the things that we can choose. And in that moment, I chose to be grateful that I had an arm, that that I could recover from this. So it was really like, and then from that day forward, that night, I promised myself I would not feel pain in my shoulder. And I have not felt pain in my shoulder since then.
Okay, so walk us through, for one to be an incredible amount of pain and then declare, I'm not going to feel any more pain, and then literally not feel any more pain. Let's unpack that because obviously a lot happened there.
I think it started with my attitude, gratitude, right? So what we know from research in the imagery training is that we can't hold two contrasting images at the same time. So if I was focused on gratitude, that's what I was going to elaborate on. That's what I was going to notice. That's where my mind would go. Now, it's possible I felt pain, but I didn't process it in the same way of like, you know, um, retreating to like fear and when will this ever get better. I more went to like proactive, what I could do that day. Preparing for, in my case, I had to be in a chair for 3 hours a day that raised and lowered my arm so that I would get full mobility. So I'd mentally prepare for that. Um, I can't explain in my situation exactly what happened, but it was just like, led me down a path of like, wow, who's looking into this sort of thing? And then when I read about, it was like I was researching weight loss programs for a client. And that's when I discovered functional imagery training. And it really aligned with my own experience of overcoming habits of the mind.
So let's go there. Talk to us about functional imagery training. What is it?
So it is a field of study that's been at the University of Plymouth for 2 decades. And it started in addiction. It started in the science of cravings. So, like, well-intentioned people would set out to give something up, right? They'd leave the office, they were motivated, they had like health reasons why, but then they'd be driving somewhere or they'd be triggered by a smell or a sound and of like glass, ice against the glass, and suddenly they'd want something that they said that they were going to give up. So cravings became a focus of this research. Well, what are cravings? They're sensory based and they hijack the cognitions in our brain, the thoughts, the rational thoughts. So they set out to think, well, could we use this imagery and can we help people crave their desired goal, giving them the ability to change the mental channel in their mind? Which is basically what I did that night when I decided to change to gratitude.
So let's walk through the food piece of this. I think it's interesting. So let's say, someone has a craving for ice cream every time they walk by a certain ice cream shop. Walk us through how that would work.
Now, this is a good one. This is actually one of the stories in the book. It wasn't ice cream, but it was like a certain cookie that was baking. And, it was in the air every night when she was walking home from work.
Let's just say you've lived in New York. Let's say it's Levain Bakery.
Oh, I love the way.
Well, maybe you should just have the cookie every
I
once
can
in a
smell
while.
it now. Okay. So yeah, so you just said Levain cookie. I'm thinking of the last time I had a Levain cookie and the weight of it in my hand. I can smell it. I can anticipate taking a big bite of it and how good that's going to feel. So I'm in an immersive imagery experience because you said Levain cookie, right? And if I continue to elaborate on that, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to go to Wainscott, Long Island, and I'm going to get a Levain cookie.
I'm going to text you my address because we don't have those in Miami. We miss them. Although our one of our dear friends who visited us, she brought Levain with her last week.
Well, that's a good friend. So anyway, if I continue to elaborate on it, and this is the theory of elaborative intrusion, I would find myself in a trance almost, like on my way to get a Levain cookie, right? But now that I've been trained in functional imagery training, I'm like, aha, I know what's happening. And I can choose to focus on my goal. I want to go to my nephew's wedding and wear a certain outfit that I picked out. And I'm going to focus on how good it's going to feel to get dressed and to go to that event and who's going to be there and what will the sound of the music be. And so I'll be in another immersive experience that is my goal.
What's that terrible, very criticized but relevant quote in this circumstance from Kate Moss? Nothing tastes as good as skinny feels.
I know. Well, we can take things too far, which is why our book and our program begins with really assessing your why, right? Because some people just can become increasingly preoccupied and rigid, and that's not what we want either. We do talk about perspective taking, and even before you set out, what's your walkaway point? At what point will you say, I'm going to not pursue this?
So when you just described walking away from Levain Bakery, in my mind, that takes a lot of fortitude. It takes strengthening those muscles. How do we get there? How do we practice in the day to day so that when Levain comes calling, we're up for it and we can walk away?
Well, it begins with knowing your values, knowing what gives you value in this world and purpose and communication. So you, we have a way of sorting through these, right? So that somebody is clear on that. Once they have that clarity and a goal, then we're going to have them mentally rehearse using them, right? So you practice it like you would any other muscle. So it may seem a lot, and we wouldn't start with the toughest thing. We may not start with walking away from the vein, but I might start with, if you're a golfer, I might start with your golf game. I might start with your yoga practice and your commitment to that. I'm going to start with something that is a desire of yours and is linked to something that is, not stressful, so that you can test drive it.
And from my understanding, the technique, maybe I'll just pause there. Can you go into detail of functional imagery training and talking about like the different characteristics, if you will? Because some people are probably listening and saying, "Well, this sounds like visualization combined with goal setting," but it's a little bit more, a lot more nuanced.
No, it's true. And I heard that one of your guests before me was Gretchen Rubin. Is that right?
Yes.
So she writes about the five senses, and functional imagery training is seven senses. So it's the five that Gretchen writes about or that we commonly go to. And then it's emotion and motion. And emotion is really key. You have to have an emotional connection to your goal, right? And seeing yourself move away from the vein, closer to what you want, seeing yourself move in your imagination, in your mind's eye, is the motion. So functional imagery training measures your ability to activate these seven senses, and then it trains in the ones that you need to strengthen. So I may say to you, for example, can you imagine a sunset? Okay. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how vivid is that sunset in your mind's eye?
5.
Can you imagine the taste of toothpaste?
Yes.
How vivid is it on a scale of 1 to 5?
5.
Can you imagine the smell of a bonfire?
Yes. We got to say that's a 3 though.
So now we know that, smell is something that I would maybe give you homework to pay attention to smell. We'd give you an assignment to build up that muscle.
Interesting.
And can you imagine the face of a dear friend?
Sure. 5.
Can you imagine being in love?
Sure. 5. So you mentioned emotion. Isn't this a little bit of a catch-22 with food? Because many of the comfort foods, if you will, that we love them because of the emotional attachment or the memories we might have, whether it's, as a child, our mother or parent or someone baking cookies or popcorn at the movie theater, or it's like bringing back these warm childhood memories, and that's a little bit of the problem we go for the comfort, the ice cream.
So the imagery that you practice toward your goal has to be an emotional connection that is more, I would say, stronger, but also more imminent to override that initial craving.
So essentially being equipped to be laser focused on the future end result rather than dwelling on the past.
In part, yeah. But I can give you an example of a so after I was trained, in the UK and I came back to the US, I was like, "Wow, okay, so I'm the first person in the US trained in this method, and I'm gonna ask for some volunteers." So one of the, individuals who volunteered was a physician and, head of his department at, Mount Sinai in Miami, and he wanted to lose weight. And when we started working, I was like, okay, let's see if this works. We used mental contrasting for a session. What if change doesn't happen? What is the future like in 5 years? That's pretty painful for anybody to imagine something that they're doing. In this case, it was significant weight gain that was going to, really impact his quality of life and his ability to travel freely. And then we contrast that with what if you start to make these changes and you start to lose weight and get in shape, putting them in the future in 5 years. What's that like? Well, that's much lighter. I feel more hopeful. I feel more confident. And now we have the mind loves black and white. It gravitates to that. So now we have this future or that. And you get to choose. That's part of the choice point. When you come to a cue, I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but one of the things that makes us different from traditional programs is we teach cues like an athlete would use a cue. And you can have cues throughout your day. Like a cue might be the refrigerator door handle. So you imagine the touch and the temperature of the refrigerator door, how it moves, how you open it, what you see. And that's your cue to you have this choice. Which future do you want? So it's before you get like ideally these cues interrupt our old habits of mind.
So as I think about the health and wellness world, the world I inhabit, it's exploded in popularity, uh, which is good. However, we're not doing so well because obesity continues to rise north of 40%. We've got a mental health epidemic, we've got a loneliness epidemic, got a lot of issues. I do think nutrition and exercise are foundational. Like you need to know the basics. I think most people generally do know the basics of what they should consume and probably avoid, yet we're not doing it. Why it seems to me, and when we had Jillian Michaels on this show a couple episodes ago, she had remarked that, there are a lot of people who just, they gain maybe 10 or 15 as they age just because life happens 10, 15, 20. And then you've got the second class of, the north of 50 pounds, 100 pounds. And there's something that's like there's something deeper there that needs to be addressed psychologically. And I kind of largely agree. With all that said, why don't you think as a public health initiative, we're talking more about this or even considering functional imagery training given how we're failing?
Well, and I think it's an excellent question. I think there's a whole industry that makes money on people being unwell. There's a whole industry that makes money on selling memberships and knowing that people won't follow through. Um, so and it's so I think it's in part money. I think functional imagery training up until now has been housed in academia, right? And that no one's figured out a way, even the founders of it, of how to translate it from the academic world to the real world. So we found a way through coaching and through health and wellness coaches and through some corporate programs that we can train people in it because it is new. I do hope that we're a disruptor. And I will disagree a little bit, which is odd, like, because my background is as a therapist, right? But I will disagree that you have to get into why someone is eating. So to get back to the client who is a physician, it was pretty, like, it's pretty simple. The method there are some key ingredients, but the method's pretty simple. We did not get into his why. And this is an individual who was obese, who had multiple times in a lifetime lost over 100 pounds, and would get in incredible shape, do like triathlons, insane things to his body, and then start eating again. And this whole thing. So for him, it was the idea in the imagery experience, which when we access imagery, we're accessing a much more, much broader part of our brain, right? So in his imagery, immersive imagery experience, he had a moment of like, oh my gosh, I've had either one foot on the gas or one on the brake my entire life. I want to imagine coasting and what that will feel like. So in his weight loss journey, he imagined coasting much more than beating himself up with, this boomerang. And then there were planning ahead. Like I never told him what to eat. This is part of our thing too. We don't get into tutorials with people because most people know they need to exercise and stop snacking and doing all these things. And once we tap into intrinsic motivation and then we add the imagery training, they're on their own journey.
Do you think culturally we set ourselves up to fail by this no pain, no gain mentality?
Yeah, I do. Not for everybody. There are those who, I've met people who are in that. They're in it their whole life, right? Many of them come from a military background and they are no pain, no gain, right? But for most of us, that doesn't work.
Yes. So my view, this was a big subject of the book my wife and I wrote, is it's got to bring you joy, whatever you do. And there's enough to do in health and wellness. There's enough science, there's enough practices, protocols, modalities that pick something you like. Because if you don't like it, you will end up dropping it. With that said, I also thought it was interesting when I had Gretchen Rubin on. She was self-aware and she knows she's an all or nothing person. And so the subject of sugar came up and she said, I just can't have it, period. I know this is who I am and that's it. I cut it out. And where I'm going with this is in terms of self-awareness, like how do we get that awareness where someone like Gretchen can say, I just know I can't do it. I can't even have one, whether it's the sugar or a potato chip or what have you, or social media. And then there's someone like me who I think is good at finding the balance. How do we get good at that?
Good at the balance or good at
Both. I think the self awareness of really, because I think the problem is we don't know which bucket we're in, and the middle is messy. They always say like there's a messy middle with alcohol. It's I don't drink or I drink too much. Pretty black and white. Then there's the middle of I'm going to drink, but how much is healthy or not healthy? That's the messy middle.
So we're all like you're highlighting the difference between you and Gretchen, but we're all different, right? There's no one size fits all. But part of but understanding, we understand as practitioners that some people are more prone to black and white. The mind gravitates to that, but some people really are black and white thinkers, right? One thing to note is they tend to be really hard on themselves and they're more prone to depression because you're either all in or you check out. So that's, this self-awareness is really important where you fall on the spectrum, and knowing what works for Gretchen won't work for you, because the more you say, I can't have sugar, the more you're going to want sugar. Just like if I say, don't think of a pink elephant, and you keep repeating that in your head, you're going to just constantly be thinking of a pink elephant. That's the way most of us are wired. We're resistant to someone telling us you cannot do this.
Oh, I'm still thinking about Levain Bakery.
Yeah. So in answer to that question, so motivational interviewing is a big part of our work. It laid the groundwork for fit. So that is, yeah. So that is someone comes to us. We are really good listeners. We listen more than we speak. We reflect back, we summarize, we We will point out an area of ambiguity where there seems to be some sort of, I want to do this, but, and we'll point it out with curiosity. I hear that you want to go to the gym, but you don't have any time in your day. And this frustrates you. So you're reflecting back to the person. They feel heard and they start to solve their own problem. They may say in answer to that, yes, but I guess I could find this window in. So you're allowing them to problem solve. Because the truth is, I think part of why our healthcare system is broken is we judge people. We tell them what to do. We tell them, if you don't stop doing X, Y is going to happen.
Well, we also we don't get to the root cause or the why.
Yeah, I don't know that we have to get to the why, which is really interesting. Again, for somebody who's practiced therapy for 19 years and has been on my own journey in therapy, there are a lot of things I have never gotten to the why of. But if I get to the why of my future, it will shape my behavior today.
Right, the why of the future. So, in the context of longevity, the conversation I've been having a lot about, like, why do you want to live a very long life? Well, I want to be around for my, and this is where I think the why is important, the future state. Well, I want to be around for a long time to be with my children and grandchildren. Well, you work so much now, you don't see them. So what's gonna, what about it makes you think about, I think when you think about the why in the future, you also may come to a conclusion that informs, how you spend your time today. That's what I'm kind of sort of going back to.
Yeah, no, exactly. And a lot of this is, it's not that simple. Again, to get to back to the example of the doctor, he got to his why, but then it was help with like, okay, so where's the problem in your day? I'm curious, where do you find yourself overeating the most? Well, in the cafeteria, because it's for doctors, it's all you can eat. It's very tempting. Okay, so what might you do differently? Well, I could prepare my lunch and bring it to my office. Okay, and what would that be like? Well, actually, that would be lonely because the cafeteria is where I socialize. Oh, so is there something that you could do to counteract that loneliness? See, I'm curious, right? And well, I guess I could make lunch for two and invite another physician. Okay, so what would that be like? Can you walk me through that? How you would prepare, like what sort of things you'd make? And anytime we trigger that, now he's in an imagery experience. Oh, what could I make? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? And that's what he wound up doing. He wound up bringing his own lunch and having a plan for how to deal with the loneliness that he might feel should he eat alone. But these are the deeper questions that we don't really explore. We'll just say, great, that sounds good. Do that.
So you mentioned his desire to socialize. What role does our friend group, our family play in all of this? Because that can be a difficult one.
Yeah, no, social contagion is we are social beings. At the end of the day, if you're on the outskirts of the herd, you're more likely to get eaten by the predator. We are really social and we are subconsciously and consciously impacted by the people around us.
So how do we, I think there's someone listening and they're thinking, oh, I'm healthy, I'm doing all the right things, but maybe it's my partner, my spouse, my friends. I love them. I try not to judge them, but maybe they're rubbing me the wrong way because they're maybe dragging me down and I'm trying to do the right thing and live a certain way. Maybe they're critical. I know that's a much bigger conversation, but what's your quick take on what to do in a situation where your friends and family are kind of living in a way that's not necessarily healthy?
First of all, I'd say to that person listening that it's really important that they take care of themselves and their health and sometimes it's having those difficult conversations with friends and family. We really can't change anyone unless they want to change. Otherwise, we're constantly, and you may be creating a more resistant child, or if you keep trying to shape them in a way that they don't want to be shaped. So it's really having some conversations with themselves and with others and being very mindful of who they're spending their time with, and it may mean a new friend group in some way. I mean, if you're because it's otherwise it gets quite lonely, right? If you're the only one working on getting healthier in your friend group or in the group that you hang out with.
Hearing you speak over the past half hour or so, I keep on coming back to this idea of mindset and how I, in my view, this is having an abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. Abundance as in I'm moving toward what I desire versus I am fearful or acting in a or experiencing shame about what I can't have or guilt or anger.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I'm sorry to
Yeah. So before I want to, with that said, I do think there's, with regards to I want to wrap it up on weight loss. We'll move on to another topic. I do think this type of mindset is really critical if you're focused on getting healthy. This idea of I'm going to focus on the end stage of where I want to move toward and the things I need to do and the things I can have, uh, versus a mentality that, I'm not good enough or I'm going to miss this, or it's almost like a victim mentality also.
I think it's knowing yourself, right? I'm a pretty active person. I'd love to get up and do yoga or row. But if somebody says to me, and this happens because sometimes I compete in the lightweights and I have to lose 5 pounds. And the word diet to me makes me want to go get a
It's got die in it. DIE.
I don't I don't wanna do it. When someone says, if a doctor said to me, "You have to diet," I would become incredibly resistant. So I think it's knowing ourselves to the language that works for us, because that triggers imagery too. So, I might for me, what I do is I picture myself weighing in and rowing with my teammates, that sensation of accomplishment, being part of a team, rather than focusing on what I can't have.
And can you talk about, there was a recent study that you share in the book where you had some pretty incredible results. Can you talk about that in terms of weight loss?
Yeah, the weight loss study was really like up until Weight Watchers, nothing had been this significant. And then it surpassed Weight Watchers, and that Weight Watchers was like really effective for 6 months. While the functional imagery training, the FIT research, the participants who received this as an intervention, it was only like 4 hours over 6 months of working with a coach. They continued after 6 months to lose weight. They even continued in a year to get fitter, to get more. So it's I think what it is we all have this innate ability, but nobody has taught us how to use it.
Well, I think it's this idea. It's this idea you teach a man to fish.
Mhm. Yeah, I like that. I like that, Jason.
You're giving people the skills for life. And I've never done Weight Watchers, but my understanding is it's pretty rigid, and this is what you have to eat. They did have a very strong sense of community, which I think is very, very important. It's kind of sad in that, without going down the Ozempic rabbit hole, they've kind of pivoted to Ozempic. They are pivoting there. But I think what's so interesting is with this method is you really are giving people the tools.
Yeah. And just to pivot a little bit away from weight loss. So one of my friends who said, I'll be your guinea pig. Go ahead, like test it on me. He's a CEO, and he was a first time CEO. He'd always been like the second in command. And he wanted to win a golf tournament. So it was like measured and trained him in imagery. And usually he had let his emotions get to him after a bad shot, and then he'd lose the game. And his friends who he had this game with, they knew how to rib him. They knew how to get to him to get him off his game. So he wound up staying on his game, winning the tournament. And then he was like, "Will this work at work?" Well, yeah. And to share a story, he was preparing for he used this imagery the night before, his first presentation to the board, right? He's going through like, he's gonna be up on stage, whose face will he see? What will the sound be? Will there be a smell? Will be there taste? What emotion am I feeling? He's tapping into all of it. What's it like to walk up on the stage? And he's going through it in his mind's eye, and he realized, oh, wow, I forgot to see if they added that second to last slide. And that's a really important slide. And now it's the night before. He can't run it by the AV people. He's got to go in the morning, and he's got to go whether the slide's there or not. So he uses his imagery ability to, slide's not there, take a deep breath, which will be my cue to relax. And I'll just act like it's seamless. So the next day, he gets up on stage. Remember, he's a first-time CEO, and he's presenting in front of a large audience. And lo and behold, the slide is not there. He didn't miss a beat. Nobody in the audience knew. And he said, had he not used his imagery the night before to mentally rehearse it like an athlete, that's how we teach people to do, he would have lost his cadence, probably gotten pretty upset with somebody on his team. So anger would have surfaced, and anger is one of his triggers that he takes him a little bit to calm down from. So that's an example of how once you start to use it, whether it's weight loss, sport, you start to then use it in high pressure situations, mentally rehearsing. How will I handle if something goes wrong? What's my cue? Okay, my cue is a deep breath. And that cue is going to trigger what it's going to feel like when you lead people on your team with confidence.
So I think that's a great example, and I think that's a very rational thought process where, maybe this slide isn't ready and what am I going to do? Then there's the irrational, which, some people suffer from anxiety, go through this. And we've all been there where there's a negative thought. And then the negative thought pattern, but it goes to a place that's completely irrational and you know it. But it's hard for you, and this is like anxiety. A lot of people suffer from this, where it's completely irrational. Like that was irrational, that really
But he
happened.
said, had he not had the imagery practice, he would have had irrational. He would have gone down a rabbit hole.
So how do we stop ourselves? Because I think everyone listening is in that negative thought pattern, whether it's this irrational thing about, our child or our spouse or work or fear, there's we can quickly go there. How do we stop it in its tracks?
Stop ourselves by, and this is funny, I always say, like, my mother, if worrying was like an Olympic sport, she'd be like the Phelps of the Olympics. She'd be like the most medaled competitor. So how do we stop it? I'll give you an example of my mom, who's really like, she doesn't believe in much that she can't see, right? So she was on the way to the hospital. Her blood pressure was spiking and she was in danger of a stroke. And my dad hands me the phone and I said, Mom, would you like to practice an imagery experience? Yes. So we put her in a garden. She could hear the sound of the birds. She could hear chirping. And suddenly she felt better. And we've done this with her connected to equipment in the hospital, and she can see her blood pressure go down. Like, that's how immediate it is, and that's how effective it is.
So you're mentioning the birds. Is that a place that people should go when they're nature and specifically audio? Like, we've all, whether it's on their whatever Spotify, Apple, you go to the nature sounds, whether it's the ocean or the birds or the whatever it might be. Is that a place we should go to immediately?
I think it's a very grounding place for most of us. Yes. Whatever your place of awe is, you might be a sailor, you might be a swimmer, you might be somebody who likes to go to the mountains, but wherever you can go in your mind's eye where you feel connected and maybe even a little small, right? It's sort of like the Noetic Society. There are these astronauts, right? Who've been to outer space, and coming back home, they realize how small the planet is and how maybe they won't worry as much when they're stuck in a traffic jam. After all, we're tiny specks spinning on a blue planet in space. But if you can start to feel a little bit smaller in some way, it really gets you out of this rumination that is getting in the way of your joy.
And what about breath? as a tool.
Oh, breath is huge. Thank you for bringing that up. I always start my sessions with breath work. And I think the breath reveals so much about us too. So I always start with measuring people's breath.
Could you walk us through what that looks like?
Sure. So you set a timer for a minute and you try and breathe as you are now and see how many breaths you have in a minute. So I've done workshops where, someone's at, we're on Zoom and calling in from all different places, and someone's on 12 breaths, but somebody in that same department is on 24 breaths. Now, if you're breathing at a rate of 24, 22 breaths or higher, you're really in an anxious state. You're going to be easily triggered, and you could be in danger of a panic attack if you start to breathe much faster than that. You're going to really perceive fear and danger in a very heightened way. So we always bring the room or the Zoom down to like 4 breaths a minute and check back into our bodies and just have people practice that before they eat, ideally, so they might enjoy their meals better. But it's that awareness of breath. Because if we're walking around and we're breathing rapidly, our body is going to be in that fight, flight, or freeze. So breath is really important.
What I'll do, what works for me is I track my heart rate. I wear a whoop. And so I know where it is when I'm calm, and I know where it's where it is when I'm not. And so if I'm sitting and I realize that I think like maybe I'm running a little bit hot at the moment, I'll check it and then kind of focus on nasal breathing and the longer exhale and bring it down. So another example in the book, which is a great real world scenario, is when we wake and we're faced with this immediate choice with our phone. Walk us through what to do.
I personally keep my phone in another room. But yeah, this is a real issue. I did an interview yesterday, which came out in Fortune magazine, about something called bed rotting. I guess was a TikTok phenomenon that they came out with just recently. And they're calling it a mental health break for young people, especially, that they wrap themselves up in their blankets and their covers. They stay in bed all day, for a good chunk of the day, and they just disengage and be on social media or on their phones. And they wanted to know my take on it. And I said, well, first of all, I'm really glad this wasn't an option for me growing up. And I certainly wouldn't, they were calling it like a mental health break. I said, I think anytime we disengage from our surroundings, like that for any great length of time, it's not a very healthy choice. But yes, I think it's just like the first thing you eat in the morning. Like some people start their day with a glass of water, right? The first thing that you put in your body, the first thing that you pick up, whether it's your phone or whether it's your meditation mat, is significant. It will set the expectation for the day. So we would have you rehearse before the morning. What are you going to do? Because you're more likely to do it if you rehearse it beforehand. You're more likely to make the choice of, I'm not, I've worked with CEOs who will not look at their email until a certain time, like 9:30 a.m., because they want that first part of the day to get what's on their agenda done. So you're going to hand the keys to somebody else, or you're going to get your needs done, what you have to accomplish.
So what's the first thing you do when you wake up?
Well, my cue is when my feet touch the ground, right? That's one of my cues. I go through my imagery. What do I want my day to look like? And then I've made it really easy. I row, so I keep a rowing machine not far from my bedroom. So I just walk right to my workout. I'll brush my teeth, part of my routine, have a glass of water, and then I work out.
So is it a bad thing that one of the first things I do is I check my aura and whoop scores?
Only if it brings you down a rabbit hole of checking, then you might want to check something else. I don't think I think that I know I have friends who do that. My girlfriend does that. Like, I don't see anything wrong with it.
Neither do I. I genuinely like it, and I think I wake up intuitively knowing how I did, of how I felt. Um, you mentioned children and TikTok. I have two young girls. I'm sure there are other parents listening, and they're thinking, "Wow, this is like such a fantastic tool to help my children uh, achieve their goals, their dreams." How can we, as parents, help implement this with kids?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is helping kids see that kids are great with imagination, right? And before as parents, we often want to jump in and fix it for them. So I'd say, like anyone listening, one takeaway would be there's so much gain when we don't jump in and fix it first, right? We call that inhibiting the writing reflex. But instead, we're curious and we ask them, well, what would that have been like? And how could you handle that? Whether, age appropriate, but really teaching kids, like, what would tomorrow be like if you did this? And letting them walk you through their day, letting them tell you what it smells like, letting them tell you what it feels like, and not judging, but allowing them to make a decision of what they want that to be.
What does it feel like scoring the goal? What does the field smell like? What do your friends' hands feel like while they're high-fiving you? What does the crowd sound like?
Exactly, exactly. Martina Navratilova, who's a friend, she wrote the foreword for the book.
You have to talk about Martina, the greatest of all time. Please talk about Martina.
She is fascinating, right? And she used imagery. Like some people are just born knowing how to use it. The rest of us, really have to be like taught or trained in it. But she, from a very early age, like 8 years old, when her father told her she was going to win Wimbledon one day, and she had watched Wimbledon with him, she, on TV, but she imagined herself holding that trophy. She felt the weight of it. She could hear the crowd. She could smell, she could taste it and felt the emotion, that. So she said that when she won Wimbledon for the first time, it did not feel like the first time.
It's so. Did you see the Novak clip from his recent Grand Slam? It went viral. We'll link to it in the show notes. He essentially he's broken the record. He's got more Grand Slams, and he's giving his speech, and he's essentially saying what you said. When I was 7 years old or 8 or what have you, I dreamt of winning, and I believed I could, and I visualized it. And I'm saying this to all the kids out there. I got goosebumps watching it. It was just so powerful.
I'm so glad you're going to link to that clip. I think that one thing I would also say to parents is don't don't impose your dreams on your kids.
So let's talk about that, because I think that happens, and I need to check myself there every once in a while, uh, with athletes, former athletes who have kids who are athletically inclined and like sports. Something, and please give me feedback here. Something I've heard and I've tried to implement. I have a daughter who's very like attached to the outcome. Like, I want to win. I don't care. I'm like, it's not about. It's about like our rules in our family are work hard, have fun, be calm. Like, that's it's a work in progress. But like, did you work hard? Yes. Did you have fun? Are you calm? Like, she gets so excited about winning. That she hates losing. She's super competitive. But like, we're really trying to like. That's great that you scored. That's great that you won. But did you have fun? Did you work hard? And my understanding is kids run into problems with mental health when it's too focused on the outcome and not the process, if you will.
Yeah. Well, if we use like Martina as an example, so from the moment she picked up a racket and stepped onto a court, she felt like she was home. So this was an intrinsic motivation in her. Yes, her father planted the seed, but it was her desire. And then what was really interesting is her self-worth was never on winning or losing. She was a human rights activist. That's how she saw herself, and that's how she wanted to use her platform. That's how she has used her platform. But if you followed her career, she made more headlines when she lost than when she won. A lot of the time the crowd was against her and for, Chrissy Everett here in the US. So she, she was tied to like externalizing her worth. It would have she wouldn't have been the champion that she is. So I think back to kids, I think it's really allowing and exploring. Um, like, what is that? So, what if you lose, if you didn't win, what would that, like, how would you feel? And really allow them to talk about it rather than quickly changing to, oh, it doesn't matter so much, because there's something in her that needs to speak to that.
Yes, and what I've communicated to her is, she'll say, "Well, I want to be the fastest or the best." I'm like, "Well, you kind of have to practice every day." She knows who LeBron James is now. She knows who Messi is. We're in Miami. I'm like, "Well, they practice every day. If you want to get really good at something and be the best, you kind of have to practice every day." Granted, she's 6, a little too young for that, but I'm like, you kind of you got to work hard. You got to practice every day.
Yeah, and I think it's also like that. I think what kids learn in sports is so much about team building and really that's invaluable. I think it's incredible. And the resiliency. The issue is people push their kids too hard, too young. It gets tied up in the stats. And we see that there's a bit of a mental health crisis in the sport world too, because and then they may come home without a medal or without a championship or even with it and have an identity crisis because they haven't developed other parts of themselves.
And from what I've seen, I don't know if the numbers support this, it's more prominent in individual sports than team sports. I think that the mental health load is a lot more significant. Tennis, swimming, a lot of, I know I'm generalizing, but it's those sports also by their nature, tennis, for example, you're on that track at an early age. What did Sharapova win Wimbledon at, like age 14, 15? Whereas basketball, LeBron James, went pro early at 18, 19, like a little bit more. Most players, their late teens, 20s versus, and that gap is only 5 or 6.
The gymnasts too. I mean, that's
Sure, that's another
a
great one.
team sport as well. And they're so young. They're just so young. And they really, for some of them, they feel like they've been robbed of a childhood.
So exactly, what in your view, when is the right age for kids? Let's say there's a kid who really has that passion, who loves the sport, who wants to go all in. And to this day and age, there's AAU, there's traveling, it starts at, if you have a 5-year-old and you want to go all in on something, you could be driving or flying around all the country if you choose to. I think it's too early. When are kids, granted, I know everyone's a little bit different here, but is there a certain age where kids are a little bit more mentally equipped to go all in on something?
I think I don't think that there's a general age that we can say, but I think that a lot of parents will say, oh, no, they really want it. They really want it. But really what the kid wants to do is please you, especially up till like age 12, 13. They're really in pleasing parents mode and not so much. But that pleasing may be perceived as from the parent, oh, no, they really want this. But I think having balance in their life is so critical in the formative years.
Well, also the socialization part of it is also really key. You know, uh, I remember there were teams I played on when I was younger where I didn't want to go up a level and play with the bigger kids where I was asked to play because I was better. I wanted to stay because I wanted to hang out with my friends. And I knew I was going to have more fun with my friends. And that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we more than what we say to our kids, it's how we model behavior to our kids. It's way more powerful. So what you're saying is, not nearly as significant as to what you're doing.
I love that. What a great message for parents. So, of all the research you've done or you've come across in writing the book or practicing, like what's been the most surprising to you?
Well, I think by far it's that, how people, once they get it, right? And they'll persevere. They'll persevere like running an ultra marathon, even though they weren't marathon runners. They'll persevere in weight loss. They'll persevere in military. Like if they know that the pain that they're in or the discomfort is temporary, rather than no pain, no gain, I'd say if you're suffering, like to bring it full circle, like I was with my shoulder, there will be an end to this suffering, right? And if you focus on what's on the other side, you can transcend that. And we see this with elite members of the military, in particular, who my co-authors worked with, the British Commandos, which are like our Royal Navy SEALs. I mean, our Navy SEALs, they're the Royal Commandos. But the ability of the imagery to transcend like what the moment you're in is extremely powerful. And I'd say that's the biggest takeaway from the research is like we all have this ability, but we really haven't begun to tap. I think we're just beginning to tap into it in the research too. I think we're just like it's the tip of the iceberg.
So, where do you think we're going in the next few years?
Well, I hope that we invest in the imagination. I think it's the only way we're going to get out of the mess we find ourselves in.
Could you just elaborate on human imagination?
Yeah, you think of any great invention, and I don't think AI would have come up with it. You know, but it is through human. We make nonlinear connections. AI cannot right now. It can't invent anything. It only copies, right? And we really are at a choice point, whether you think it's the environment or you think it's artificial intelligence or, race relations and class relations. We are at so many choice points and we really can't wrap ourselves up in the bed covers and pretend it isn't happening, right? But if we can transcend, I think most of us are so busy in our day that we're not really getting to what matters. Right. So the interesting thing, there should be like a little warning on our book almost, because some people that have gone through our program, like fascinating things have happened. Like there was a doctor at Stony Brook and she's not there anymore. She decided after going through her, practice and her imagery of what she really wanted, she's moved to Greece with her family. We've had other people leave their job and they're like surfing in Australia. Like suddenly, and not everybody, but when you really get down to like what's important in your life, you realize that a lot of the stuff that we're doing is just habits. We're just copying people around us. It's not really important to us.
Well, I think so many of us have just become numb. We go through the motions. And look, I've been there. And there are sometimes I have to check myself. And even though I love what I do, but there are sometimes I need to check myself. Am I going through the motions? What am I doing? What do I really want? What am I spending my time on?
Yeah, and sometimes, I was in a very comfortable place in my life when I had the riding accident. I made a conscious choice to step out of a very privileged life I had and step into the one that I knew I was meant to live. And part of that has been writing this book and committing to bigger causes in my life. Um, so sometimes out of suffering comes this like, oh yeah, that's who I am. right? And when I was falling from that horse, I didn't know if I'd walk away. I didn't know if I'd be paralyzed. I didn't know if I would be crushed. It was like that close a call for me. It was a bad one. And I had this experience of like, wow, what if that was it? I haven't yet begun to live because I'm busy tending to a life of like multiple houses and dinner parties. And on the outside, it looked amazing. But on the inside, it was incredibly empty.
And so, in closing, is there anything we haven't touched on that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah, I would say start small. Maybe just start with the breath exercise that we did today. Just becoming aware of how many breaths you have in a minute and committing to at least once a day slowing that down and getting out of what you would call the numbness.
And let's say you are blessed with a giant billboard, since you're in the east end of Long Island on the Long Island Expressway, and on the billboard you could put anything to get your message out. What would be on your billboard?
It would be something really simple, like something with a choice point, because like it could even be hashtag. Like we're starting this campaign of like my sister who hates the gym. She really hates the gym more than anyone I've ever met. And she's one morning she sent me, she was like a photo of herself at the gym and it said hashtag choice. I think if we could all share our choice points, we could lead to a social contagion, getting us out of numbness, getting us into our bodies, into our lives. If we could just spread that word that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And it's your choice of what future you want.
I love that. I've used that line before, the space between stimulus and response. As humans, we're blessed with that.
Yeah, I know, and it was Viktor Frankl who came up with that. And when you think about it, he was in a concentration camp when he wrote that. And if he was able to transcend that kind of human suffering, and you know what he did when he was in that concentration camp? He imagined teaching. He would go through courses in his mind because he was a psychiatrist and teaching students. He would see his wife's face. Like he vividly lived in a future that he belonged in. And he never stopped living. He said he saw a lot of people around him give up on living. And he was never going to give up on living.
Yes. Reminds me also, are you familiar with the Stockdale paradox?
No.
So Admiral Stockdale, I think he ran on the ticket with Ross Perot when Ross Perot ran for president. And he was this decorated war veteran, and he was a prisoner of war. And I forget how long he was a prisoner. And he made it, and a lot of his colleagues who were captured did not. And he said that his colleagues that didn't make it had this like false sense of hope where they would say, I'm going to be home for Christmas. Then Christmas would come, they weren't home. Or I'm going to be home for Easter, and would go on and go on. Then finally they gave up. Whereas Stockdale's view was, I don't know when, but I'm going to get out of here. And mentally he was able to make it through. And I always thought that was fascinating.
It is. And there's a lesson in there for all of us. Because I think one of the stories in the book that really resonated with people is this commando in training who gave up because his expectation was, they told us to run to this point. I got here with a lot of pain and suffering. And when I got here, they said, now you have to run back, right? So when you're when you're training for this, there's always within walking distance, a warm minivan with hot chocolate. And they're telling you, quit, because there's your minivan with hot chocolate. So he got to this point and he opted for the minivan with hot chocolate. Whereas another soldier was like, I knew they were going to trick us. All right, run back. Okay, I'm running back. Right. He and it turned out he didn't have to run all the way back. It was just another mile. But how many times do we give up because our expectation is this is going to happen this way and it doesn't? I'm out.
I'm waiting for the minivan with Levain.
With Levain.
Joe, thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's a pleasure, Jason.